My name is Andy Pulte. I teach in the Plant Sciences Department at UT in Knoxville. I've been to your county many times, and I've been glad to visit the gardens there and meet a lot of the people there. I've spoken at the summer celebration several times. Have not been able, of course, missed it this past year, and so really missed out on that. Today, I'm glad you're joining me. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen me speak at something like Summer Celebration before. And today's probably a little bit different than some of the talks that you've seen me given at Summer Celebration. I give a lot of, I guess, kind of flashy talks with a lot of pictures, pretty pictures and pretty plants. But we're going to be talking a little bit about a different subject today, about how new plants come to market. You know, a lot of times we go to nurseries, garden centers, go to even big box stores. And, you know, from the master gardener standpoint, I think it's pretty interesting just to kind of take time to consider how some of those new plants end up coming to market, the process, some of the terminology. We're going to be spending some time today on really
Andy is on mute.
Yes.
Accidentally muted
me.
I'm sorry. I was trying to mute everyone else.
No, that's good. That's good. And so, you know, sometimes you go to nurseries, garden centers, you know, so we're just going to spend some time considering how those plants come to market. We're going to be talking about that today. This talk pairs well with a nice Chardonnay in a plastic cup or a nice cup of tea. And so we're just going to have kind of a relaxed time today. We're even going to be talking about patents and trademarks. I'm sure that there's probably at least a lawyer or a former lawyer in the group. So keep your comment. I hope that I do everything right when it comes to those patents and trademarks. So we are going to use a chat a little bit today, and so be ready for that. I just need 1 second to get my PowerPoint up. Celeste has given me all the power in the world here to share my screen. And I think I've got it up right there. Let me get Celeste, give me a thumbs up if you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, good. Okay, so how do new plants come to market? I've got to get to my. So here's a couple of things, and I'm going to have a lot of slides with that do have some text on them. We're not going to read every bit of the text, but I do kind of want to know what we're talking about today and what you should kind of expect to learn from the presentation. And just like I tell the students, if you don't know these things by the end of the class, one of us didn't do our jobs. It was either me or the listener. But I hope that we can kind of learn some of these things today. First, you know, you should be able to use some of the common terminology and taxonomic language that's associated with this subject. Know why plants are patented and why their names might be trademarked. How does the process work of selecting plants and how do they come to market? Understanding about plant brands, that can be confusing for people, and what is a series of plants. And then we're just going to kind of talk in general about how, you know, really new plants come to market. And so I wish my buddy Lucas Holman from Wilson County was the extension agent was with us today. Because he could maybe answer this question because he's a big daylily guy. But
he spoke to us on daylilies in July.
Oh, in July. I'm sure that was riveting. So don't we have a lot of good plants already? Kind of is the question, was where this starts is. So I did this search on whatever the American Daylily, Americalis Society's website. And how many cultivars of daylilies are registered? 89,529. Well, I probably made this screenshot 2 years ago, and so probably, you know, 95,000 by now. So, you know, do new plant. We really need new plants, and so you guys kind of think about that a little bit as we go through our talk. I said we're going to talk about terminology, so let's start off with a little bit of terminology and just taxonomic stuff. And you guys are great master gardeners. A lot of you are very well versed in plant identification and some of the taxonomic terminology that we use in the world of plants. But this is my thing, so you have to bear with me because I'm a plant ID teacher, and so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So when we say straight species of a plant, typically we're talking about the way the plant is found in nature. Typically reproducing from open pollinated reproduction, naturally occurring. And sometimes you'll even hear people call that the garden variety. If you see here this Acer palmatum, of course, there's all these different forms of Japanese maple, but typically in the wild, that plant is a green-leaved plant. Acer palmatum is a native, it has a native range that goes from China all the way to Japan. And it cuts through that hanging down peninsula. And I always ask the college students, what is it, that hanging down peninsula right there? You guys are smart, so type into the chat what this hanging down peninsula is right there. For some reason, the college students don't have any clue what this big piece of land is that's hanging out here. So type that into the chat so I know how smart the master gardeners are. Acer palmatum, the Japanese maple, has this huge range. And that's where the straight species of Japanese maple is typically found. You'll also see, and you see this a lot when you see a scientific name of a plant, you might see this term variety, and it is abbreviated VAR period within the scientific name of a plant typically. So a variety is a naturally occurring variant within that straight species population. A lot of times that will be very geographic. And I'm going to give you some examples of some plant variants. Usually a variety can also be called a subspecies. You might hear that piece of terminology. And again, a lot of times it has this little distinct geographic niche within its native population. And you'll see some abbreviations. Sometimes you'll see the abbreviation SUBSP or even SPP, which I don't really like. But typically in a scientific name of a plant, you might see this term variety. And here's probably one of the most common ones that you'll see, Acer palmatum, variety Atropurpureum. And that is just telling us that this is a naturally occurring variant within the wild population that happens to have purple leaves. And this happens with a lot of different plants. And when we bring them into the garden, when we give them a scientific name, we denote that by giving it this varietal. And in this case, it's variety Atropurpureum. You might even be familiar I'm trying to use all Japanese maples just to kind of make this easy, but of course, this goes across a lot of different plants. Here's an example, Acer palmatum variety Dissectum Atropurpureum. Now, in fact, a lot of nurseries wouldn't even write all that on a tag, but Dissectum is a varietal that happens sometimes. It's a naturally occurring variant. And then here you've got also a purple leaf dissected plant. And so you can see this fluffy kind of cut filigree type foliage. That's what we mean by dissectum. And you can see this, and so that's what we mean when we say variety. When you see a scientific name of a plant, you might also see this term, forma. And what a forma is also a naturally occurring variant within a species, but it's quite a bit more rare than a variety. It is not as easily reproducible from seed, and not as reproducible through sexual propagation. And there's a couple examples of this that we see. Here's one in our native North American holly that's native to North America, Ilex opaca or opaca, Forma xanthocarpa. And what that means is that this has a yellow fruit. Well, if you know our American holly, it typically has red berries, but every once in a while, in the wild, you'll see a naturally occurring yellow variant of that plant, and it is Forma xanthocarpa. Now, there's some other formas that you might be familiar with. Retibita Mexican hat has several different flower colors that are actually variants that are found in the wild. Norway spruce have a lot of formas that are Forma columnaris, and Forma columnaris means that it's tall and skinny. So that's kind of goes through some of the naturally occurring things that we see. But as gardeners, what we deal with quite a bit are cultivars of plants. You know, you go to that, the big plant sale that you, in collaboration with our station there in the UT Gardens Jackson, put on. A lot of the plants that you sell are cultivars of plants. And cultivars are plants that have distinguishing characteristics that separate them from the straight species of the plant. Now, by the Code of Botanical Nomenclature, they call the names that we give plants that end up being cultivars fanciful names. And so we know we can probably name some fanciful named plants that are cultivars in our home landscapes. You like all the hydrangeas, and every hydrangea that Jason and you guys sell at your plant sales all have different cultivar names that distinguish them from the straight species. And so a cultivar, example of a cultivar might be Acer rubrum October Glory. And that has been given this fanciful name that distinguishes it from the straight red maple that we see in the wild. It is possible to have a cultivar of a botanical variety or a subspecies, like we talked about with those Japanese maples. So here, back to Japanese maple, Acer palmatum butterfly. This is a variegated Japanese maple that has a cultivar name called butterfly. But here with the variety thrown in here, Acer palmatum variety dissectum atropurpureum tamakiyama, this Japanese maple, this big mouthful of a scientific name, tells us about it. Tells us that this is a purple-leaved, dissected or cut-leafed variety that is distinguished from that by doing something else that this cultivar does. And when we talk about different types of plants and how plants are crossed and hybridized, there's a couple of different types of hybrids that we are familiar with and that we see. Well, we might not even be, really realize when we get to the garden center what we're looking at. What we're probably most familiar with as gardeners is the first one here, intraspecific hybrids. So you think about, you take a white petunia and you take a red petunia and you breed those two together, and you're very likely to get a pink petunia, that intermediate between those two. But those are the same plants. You're crossing the exact same plants. Those are intraspecific hybrids. It's a petunia, and it's the same two petunias. You're putting those together, and you're getting a hybrid of those two, an intermediate between those two. But then we get down to a little bit kind of rarer cases. The first one there, intraspecific hybrids. These are controlled or chance. They could just happen by chance. Hybrids between related species. So plants with typically the same genus, but maybe they've got a specific epithet or species name. And I've given the example here, if you look kind of in the middle of your screen here, and this one you might be familiar with, Hamlis mollis times Hamlis japonica, resulted in this very garden-worthy plant, which is Hamlis X intermedia. This is the hybrid witch hazel. This is a shorter variety. And so if we know about these plants, one of these two plants, I forget which one is taller, but one of them is very tall and one of them is very short. And we get them together and they make this intermediate, this kind of mid-sized plant that's very garden-worthy. Every once in a while it can happen. We can have what we call intrageneric hybrids. This is a hybridization between two genera of plants. So the genus of the plant is completely different. I've given you an example of these two genera that have come together. Gordonia is a plant, and then there's another native tree called Franklinia, and those have been hybridized together, those two different genuses, and they call that smash up X Gordlinia. Here's another one. You're familiar with English ivy, Hedra helix. you might be familiar with Fatsia japonica. Those two are from two different genuses, and they've come together, and you can see how they mark that. They put an X in front of the scientific name, and the scientific names have been kind of smashed up here to make this one called X. fatshedra. And it's kind of interesting. Of course, English ivy is a vine. Fatsia is kind of a shrub. And so you get this plant that has the capability to climb like a vine, but also is kind of shrubby as well, which is kind of an interesting plant. Okay, so that's kind of the fast and dirty nomenclature stuff, kind of the wordy stuff there. But let's talk about some specific plants here. So this intraspecific hybrid, so I talked about two different species within the same genus, an interspecific hybrid being crossed. Here's one that you probably know. Abelia chinensis was hybridized with Abelia uniflora, and out of that cross, they got this plant on the left, Abelia x grandiflora, and here's a cultivar called Little Richard that came out of that cross. Now this is a little bit shorter plant. And then we've got this one on the right. This is Abelia x grandiflora kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope was a branch sport that was discovered off of Little Richard. And so this interspecific cross resulted in these garden-worthy plants. So kaleidoscope is a golden branch sport of that plant, Little Richard, and it came from a nursery in North Carolina. So I'm going to play a couple little videos here throughout my presentation, and I've given you a question here at the top, and I would really appreciate maybe you could type your answers into the chat. I'll give you a second to do that. But the question is, how does he talk about the plants that he works with? How does he talk about the plants that he works with? And so I'm going to leave it to Celeste to tell me if for some reason you can't hear my video, but I think you should be able to.
Do you ever wonder where new plants come from? Well, I reckon this guy can tell us here. How are you, Chris?
I'm very well, Milton.
Good. Where are you from?
I'm from Plants Management Australia, and we look after intellectual property from new breeders from around the world.
Okay. And do you bring plants into the country, trial them, and then put them out to garden centres for sale?
We do indeed. So we travel the world talking to new breeders about their new innovations. So whether it be a foliage form or a flower or height or width, and we import them through the quarantine process. And then we get them trialled from all around Australia and into New Zealand. And then we do the promotion and marketing behind it all.
Well, that's where they come from. And now tell me, is this one of your guys?
It is one of ours. It's a Abelia kaleidoscope. It comes from the United States. And we've trialled it throughout Australia. So it grows from Cairns to Hobart to Perth. And it's a beautiful hardy plant.
Okay, and I'm gonna wait patiently. So I will turn up the video for the next time. Maybe you guys can turn off. I hope everybody heard that. But maybe just some keywords in there. Type into the chat there. How does he talk about the plants that he works with? I was also glad to see that some people knew that that was a Korean peninsula. Okay, I'm seeing some people here. We're typing in passionately enthusiastic. A couple people couldn't hear it. I'm sorry, friends. Well, I actually kind of read it a little bit different. He's very familiar with them, but he really talks about these plants kind of like widgets, like these things that he's selling. I kind of get a lot of kind of the commercial aspect of it. Really trying to drive up enthusiasm, kind of for the newness of it. But we're gonna kind of dive into that a little bit more as we kind of go along here. So I'm gonna go through here. So let's talk about this. So we're gonna talk about patents and trademarking plants, because this is, a a lot about what that guy talked about in the video, but really kind of a really hot topic and something that has really come to the forefront in horticulture over the last 20 years in particular. And we're going to dive into this a little bit. And so all of the above plants listed here that were developed, were developed and bred using that plant that we talked about and that guy was talking about in the video, kaleidoscope, Abelia kaleidoscope. So here in these single quotes in the middle here, these are all cultivars, LG01, Opistol 102, WEV01, Opistol 40, okay? And I'm going to talk to you more about this plant Opistol 40. But remember that all of these plants were developed and bred using this Abelia kaleidoscope, okay? Here out of Concept Plants, Abelia X grandiflora Opistol 40. It is patented. When you see this number next to a plant, you're going to see this patent number right here that tells you what number of US patent it was given. And then this plant was also given this name right here, Mystic Daydream, which is the trademark for this name. So Abelia grandiflora Mystic Daydream. This has got, you know, these colorful sepals. It's shorter. It's distinguished. It distinguishes itself from its parent plant Kaleidoscope and whatever else they bred it with. But we're going to talk about this plant as we go through Opistol 40 and kind of what happens to it. So plant patents. Plant patent is granted to an inventor who creates or discovers and asexually reproduces. That's one of the most important parts. You're able to asexually reproduce a new and distinct variety of plant. The life of the plant patent is 20 years from the date that the patent application is filed with the patent office. So the life of the patent is good for 20 years once you go and get that patent. The first plant patent was, plant patents were started in 1930. The first plant was actually patented in 1931. It was a rose. And you can read what I've written here. It was a climbing, ever-blooming rose, was the very first plant patent, and that was in 1931. Here's a copy. Here's what that plant patent looked like. It was just a drawing of the plant and then a description of why it was distinct or unique and about the inventor. But there were companies that were onto this idea of protecting their intellectual property before 1930 in the plant patenting process. I love this example right here. In 1914, the Stark brothers paid $5,000 for this seedling. Well, it was a apple tree that was grown and producing fruit. They paid $5,000 for the tree that would be later called the Golden Delicious apple. And so you can see these news stories that were drummed up, the $5,000 tree in a cage. This is in 1914. But what Stark brothers did then is that when you bought their apple, you had to sign an agreement. And I'm kind of circling right here. Stark Brothers, Golden Delicious, the greatest yellow apple agreement. In receiving this tree, you agree that you are fully aware that you have signed and will carry out this whole process, that you will not give away or sell or permit anyone else to take scions, buds, or cuttings from the Golden Delicious tree. And they give $100 reward for anybody who finds it. They say that they've never lost a case. They've got plant protection, private detectives, in these different places. And so that's how the first ideas of trying to protect, quote unquote, intellectual property of plants. And really, this is the earliest example that I know of is Stark Brothers going through that. So what plants can be patented? A living organism which expresses a set of characteristics determined by a single genetic markup or genotype. It can't be artificially manufactured. Cultivars, sports, mutants, hybrids, even genetically transformed plants, that would be like a GMO, can be all patented. They must have been discovered in a cultivated area. Algae and microfungi are regarded as plants, but not bacteria. you can't patent a bacteria as a plant. So let's go back to Opistol 40, Abelia X grandiflora Opistol 40. It's plant patent number right there, 25193. Trademark name Mystic Daydream. So here's the question, and I'm going to open up the chat so I could read this. I'd love you to participate here. Why would you give a plant a cultivar name Opistol 40, right? Wouldn't like, why wouldn't you why wouldn't you use, make the cultivar Mystic Daydream or Summer Crush or Summer Fun or, Beautiful Rose or something like that? So again, I'm gonna give you a second here, type into the chat so we can kind of stay interactive here in this virtual world. Help me out here. Why would you give a plant the cultivar name Opistol 40? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of great great answers coming through here. Yeah, a lot of times, and I do some plant breeding. I'll tell you a little bit about this here. And you have to give them, you have to have code names for all of them. You're growing out, 2,000 seedlings, and you have to identify each one of them. And so they might get a name or a number like Opistol 40, Opistol 41, Opistol 42, and that denotes all these different individual plants. But I'm going to give the gold star to Rebecca. And so Rebecca, we're going to talk a little bit more about your answer. So you get the top #1 gold star of the day, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why Rebecca has gotten gold star. So trademark names. Present day plant commerce has focused on protection of new introductions so that the names cannot be used for any other plant or product. If someone other than the discoverer wishes to grow and market a trademark plant, a license and royalty agreement must be consummated. Trademarks names have no taxonomic validity, and so they don't mean anything about the plant. They don't have to tell you anything about the plant. You can call, a plant the tallest plant in the world blue dwarf if you want to, even if it has nothing to do with the plant. So trademark names are important. So let's learn a little bit about trademark names. You're probably familiar with trademark names. Anyone who shows continued use of a specific name for a plant can write a trademark name on it. There's no real legal, you don't have to have a lawyer to do that. You just have to show two things. One, continued use, and then also protection of that trademark. But registered trademark, of course, is a little bit different. So really, trademark equals you consider it your trademark. Registered trademark, you and the government consider it your trademark. It's registered with the government. And so it is a little bit different. So back to Opistol 40, Abelia X grandiflora, Opistol 40, Mystic Daydream. Why would you give a plant the cultivar name Opistol 40? Well, I mean, and Rebecca hit on this a little bit, and I told you that plant patents are only good for 20 years. And so you are hoping over that 20-year time that people get to know your plant by its trademark name, not its cultivar name. So you're hoping that people get to know your plant not by its cultivar name, but by its trademark name, because trademark names are good forever as long as you have continued use and show continued use of it, and then also you defend the use of your trademark name if someone were to try to use it. And so So you can, if you are in control of a trademark name, you can then, in essence, perpetually charge someone to use that name. And so, because if you started calling something, Abelia Mystic Daydream Opustal 40 after the plant patent ran out, which you sure could do, call it Opustal 40, and somebody came in and they were looking for Mystic Daydream, then they would be pretty confused. Let's talk about Honeycrisp Apple. So Honeycrisp Apple, the breeding started in 1974, and it was given a number in the field, MN1711. MN1711. And then they found this a great apple. It was developed by the University of Minnesota. It's one of my favorite apples. I'm sure it's one of your favorite apples too, a lot of you. If you ever get a chance to try one called Cosmic Crisp, I think it's a little bit better. But this apple used to be patented by the University of Minnesota. Its patent just ran out. It was patented on March 20th, 1990, and you can see I've circled that there. So its patent has run out. But look on the bottom here. What did they patent this plant as? Honeycrisp. And so the patent is now run out on Honeycrisp. And so now anyone can use the name, can grow and market that apple under the name Honeycrisp. Was this a mistake? Up to this point, excuse me, the patent revenue for the University of Minnesota has been far in excess of $10 million for the licensing agreement for using the name Honeycrisp and the association with his apple. And so you can think of it in two ways. One, well, they're kind of, in some way, they're giving it back to the people, where the Honeycrisp can now be grown by farmers throughout the U.S. without paying their patent fee, their royalty rights. And then another thing you think about, this is kind of potentially was probably from their standpoint a mistake, but they weren't thinking about it, and a lot of people weren't thinking this way in 1990, and so they went ahead and they actually patented it under the name Honeycrisp. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so trademarks. The owner of the trademark does not have to own a word or an image, but rather the use of its identity, the source of goods or services. And again, doesn't expire. And so we've talked about that. So let's talk about, I guess, the title of the talk. Let's talk about that. Main ways new plants are created, found. Well, sometimes it naturally occurs. Open pollinated, naturally occurring things that are found, mutations out in the wild, like this picture of this clover right here. That's a natural mutation. And it can be purposely created. A lot of the plants that now we see in the market are purposefully created, and through a lot of different ways. Controlled pollination, forced mutations, grafting is one way that we can change and manipulate plants. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. Here's one great example of a plant that has not been relatively on the market, that was a straight species introduction into the market. And it's Amsonia hubrechtii. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Arkansas Amsonia hubrechtii. It was named after an 18th century Virginian physician who actually took care of George Washington. He was George Washington's main physician, Dr. Charles Amson. It was discovered by Leslie Hubrecht. Leslie Hubrecht found it in the early 1940s in the wild. And that's in North America, to come across Amsonia hubrechtii in the wild. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing to think that thing hadn't been discovered yet. But what I love about Leslie Hubrecht is he loved mollusks, he loved slugs and snails, and he actually had made a collection of 500 specimens that is actually now held in the Field Museum in Chicago. And so he was just a naturalist. He knew kind of unique things when he saw it. So I love talking about Leslie Hubrecht because he was just stumbling around in the wild and he came across Amsonia hubrechtii, which I'm trying to remember, 2015, 14, it was the perennial plant of the year. And so that's kind of a cool story. Also, natural mutations are a way that we find plants, you know, a sport on what we call a sport on a plant, where, you know, maybe you have a piece of a branch that looks a little bit different, or maybe a witch's broom. And I'm gonna show you some pictures of these. That's common among conifers, responsible for many of the choice selections of conifers that maybe that we every once in a while see. This is long, I'm not gonna read it here, but we also will run into things like fasciations. You probably know with celosia, coxcomb celosia, that's a form of fasciation. Witches' brooms, sports, this kind of things. I'm not gonna read all of this, I just kind of got it up here to make sure that I talk about it here, but I'm gonna show you some pictures of it. So here's an example of, this is Cryptomeria japonica cristata. This is the crested cryptomeria. And this kind of mutation where it's smashed together foliage, we call that fasciations. And that's a naturally occurring mutation. The one you're probably most familiar with is the celosia, coxcomb celosia. Maybe some of you have seen witches' brooms. Don't get confused with mistletoe. But in particular, conifers are known to do these mutations every once in a while. And so what a good nursery person might do is come and get a piece of this and propagate this witch's broom. And they might find a plant that has a completely different form. Instead of, you know, tall and narrow, it might be rounded, or it might be narrow, or it might be like a pancake on the ground, something like that. But we're all, you know, you're always looking for bud sports as well. Here's a golden mutation here that has come off of this kind of a natural mutation here on the. Then we also see, why can't I think of this? I can't think of that plant's name. Somebody put it in the chat. See it all over California. Can't remember its name. I'll think about it in bougainvillea. Controlled pollinations as well is a way that you do it quite a bit. This is what you'll see a lot in big breeding programs where you're making controlled crosses. And then what you do a lot of times is you'll cover them up with things like bags to make sure that no other pollen sneaks in there. So that's where you know exactly where the pollen came from, exactly the cross that you made. And that's called exclusion. A lot of times they'll do something called emasculation. The guys will love this. This is where they actually take all the male parts off of the flower just to make sure that there is no possibility of contamination as well. But you know, this is a long process. Finding new plants is a long process. Here's a story that I'm not going to read, but it's about this great conifer nursery called Isley's Nursery, talking about how they sowed they were looking for a blue version of Chamaecyparis obtusa nanogracilis, and how they evaluated 50,000 seedlings and didn't get it. They got some other stuff, but just think about the time and the space to row out, to grow for years and years and years, 50,000 seedlings, and to not get what you want. But, you know, so, and then, you know, then you later on, you deal with people who, you know, complain about paying $7 for a pot, but you spent, you know, 20 years of your life and you know, watch 50,000 seedlings grow before you made any sort of selections. You kind of think, you think about paying $3.99 for a pound of Honeycrisp apples, but the cross was made in 1974. And I mean, that hasn't been in the grocery store for more than 5 or 6 years, you know, to any large extent. And so I do a little bit of this kind of breeding. I actually breed hibiscus. This is a picture of we don't even need to hear the volume here, but this is tropical hibiscus that this is going to do. You know, and this is, in a lot of cases with a lot of different plants, this is the process. Literally, you're taking pollen from one place and you're moving it to another. And this is what they would call a self-pollination or a self-cross here, but really just literally moving the pollen from male parts to female parts. But then the hard part is after that, where you have to keep track of all this stuff and grow all this stuff out. And here's some of the hibiscus breeding that I do my own self. And so here, after making crosses all summer, each one of these rows is a seed pod. So each one of these rows is a seed pod, and you can see I've got good germination on some of these rows, and then some of these rows, maybe only one, maybe one seed germinates. Well, if I get this good row germination, each one of those individual plants is given a tag, given a number, grown out. We're going to watch it and hopefully get that thing planted out into the garden. And then you got to plant them all out, and you got to wait, and you got to watch. And here's maybe this is 2 years ago. This is my hibiscus field where we've grown out a bunch of hibiscus. We're looking for new and interesting things, and we've got breeding goals, and we're trying to kind of figure out a few things to make hibiscus better. Here's a great rowing out of Hydrangea paniculata. There's Jason right there, where we're at Spring Meadow Nursery in Michigan, looking at the final plants that they're looking at after culling out tens of thousands of seedlings of Hydrangea paniculata. They've gotten down to these few, 400 or 500 plants that they're evaluating, where they might choose 3 or 4 plants out of this entire, after whittling down from 30 or 40,000 seedlings, they're down to 500, they're down to 400, and then they'll get that whittled down to about 3 plants. And so that's just kind of how it works. And so, I mean, it's good for people to know the process that this goes through. Not as familiar in ornamental plant breeding, but people do what they call mutation breeding. Mutation breeding, sometimes referred to as variation breeding, is a process of exposing seeds or seedlings to chemicals or radiation in order to generate mutations. Some of these mutations, like a variegation, or maybe the plant could be shorter or taller or something like that. And so there is genetic breeding going on where they are doing what we call forced mutations to get some of these differences in plants as well. But mostly this has been in the agronomic crop world. There's been a lot of rice varieties that have been developed through forced mutations, genetic mutations. Here's just some examples. Here's kind of some known forced mutation varieties. There's a Delosperma, there's several Delosperma and Dianthus, which kind of surprised me, different chrysanthemums, but a lot of rice that has been done with genetic breeding. Grafting is another way that new varieties can be formed. Having different understocks on plants do imbue plants with different characteristics. And that can, be, in a lot of cases, it's dwarfing, making things smaller, giving things more disease resistant, these kind of things. And so in some ways you can make different varieties of plants through developing new methods, through isolating things that might be unique or different, and finding ways to combine plants through grafting as well. And so that's just another way that tends to happen. And then after you come up with those plants, you got to trial them. And so, you've got a great trial garden there in the State Botanical Garden of Tennessee Jackson. And we do the same thing in Knoxville as well. But typically a company that is spent all this time, they need to know where it grows well and how it does. And so you've gone through all that process, and then you need to send it out and let people test it. And there's testing going on in all of our gardens throughout Tennessee, and then throughout the United States as well. And there's a broad geographic distribution of those plant trials. And then after all that, and kind of simultaneously, you're building up stock of those plants. These companies, they are wanting to release plants and have it available throughout the United States. And so we're talking about very large numbers, in particular when things are asexually propagated, cuttings that have to be taken, stock plants that need to be built up, and that takes a long time, over a very long time. So let's talk about branding and marketing of new plants. The wave petunia is really where, you know, we point to that real true branding of plants, looking at plants like brands, just like we think of like Nike as a brand of athletic wear, thinking of plants as a brand. And I really think that, you know, in my mind, this started with the wave petunia. I know many of you have grown the different types of wave petunias. Interestingly enough, the wave petunia was developed as an accident by a Japanese beer company looking for different flavorings for its beer. I don't know if some of you may have been to Japan, but they just have different kind of tastes for food. I mean, I've been to a Japanese grocery store and it's, I mean, you see what a seaweed flavored Oreos or whatever it is. I mean, they're just really into some things that are different than Western taste. And so they're looking for different flavorings for beers in Japan. And they found this low growing kind of mat forming petunia. And then we were off to the races. And so, you know, they come up with this idea of this, you know, pink pot that's real flashy. No one had ever really seen, you know, a plant that, I mean, it can only be sold in this pot. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And now it's done, and every plant is done that way. And actually, in our gardens in Knoxville, Tennessee, this was a trial plant, just a number in 1995 in our trials at the State Botanical Garden in Tennessee in Knoxville. Other examples of plant brands might be, and the wave petunia, now there's a lot of different wave petunias, there's a big brand. You might be familiar with this brand, Endless Summer. The one they call the original, which I guess is this one here on the right, was the one that they released first. But then they released these subsequent hydrangeas, and so it becomes this series of hydrangeas kind of within this brand of Endless Summer hydrangeas. Okay, confused yet? So let's talk about another apple, the Pink Lady apple. Maybe some of you have heard of the Pink Lady apple. Expired patent, expired in 1992, but they went about things different than the Honeycrisp people did. Malix X domestica. This Pink Lady is not a cultivar necessarily of an apple. It's actually this cultivar Crisps Pink, and it's a registered trademark that's marketed under the brand name Pink Lady. And so Pink Ladies are actually this cultivar Crisps Pink, apples that are grown under the standard of the Pink Lady brand of apples. And so they can continue in perpetuity growing and marketing this apple forever and ever and ever and ever and ever under this name Pink Lady, where in theory someone could come across and call Honeycrisp apple something else and try to sell it to you as something else in the future. And, you know, and apples are kind of interesting. You know, you take a Honeycrisp apple grown in Tennessee may not taste quite the same as one grown in Minnesota. And so this is kind of interesting in the apple market. You know, and then once you find those plants, you find ones that are valuable for the different regions of the country. Then these big nurseries have to start producing these plants. And here's a video of hibiscus fields in Michigan, of the different hibiscus varieties that Walter's Gardens which is a wholesale grower in Michigan. Here is acres and acres and acres of hibiscus that they're growing for the retail and the wholesale market. And so it is big business. It's not, you know, in most cases, most of the plants that you see are not coming from mom and pop type places. And I mean, it's amazing to see what goes on in the world of these kind of big marketed plants. here is a propagate. Jason and I were actually at a nursery together. Here's a propagation nursery before they would ever go out into the field, of course, or these are liners. Maybe some of you at the plant sales there have bought these little quick turn liners before. And so this is where they grow. They grow in these big, huge, huge, tens of thousands of square feet of nursery space before they ever get to you in the nursery. And, and they're packed and they're shipped and they're brought over to us. And so today, we've talked very quickly about some of the methods and the rhymes and the reasons. I'm sorry, not a lot of, sexy pictures of plants today, but a lot of kind of information, I hope, about those plants that you sell at your plant sale and how they end up coming to fruition. And so thank you for letting me be a part of your night tonight. I hope that you learned a few things. And Celeste, thank you for inviting me. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. That whole entire topic can be very confusing, and you presented it in a very clear fashion. So thank you for that. And we did have a few questions here in the chat box. Mona asked, is the chemical or radiation mutation a hit or miss type of situation, or can it more precisely change specific features that you're like targeting?
Right. Well, yeah. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll actually germinate the seeds, and sometimes the seeds are radiated. Sometimes they will germinate the seeds, and when they're in the cotyledon stage, they'll actually spray them, and then they'll evaluate the ones that survive the process. And so that's the first part about it that's hit or miss, is that they actually end up mostly evaluating the ones that survive. And so that's a good point right there. When it's in that cotyledon stage, it is hit or miss. It really is. You get nothing, you might get something.
Mm-hmm. And then Martha asked, she was recognizing how certain plants are always, you always see them referenced like with the same picture. Like she used, for example, Empress Woo, they always show the same outdated picture of a man
Right.
looking at this big, huge hosta. Like, is there something going on with that? Does that have something to do with its patent or what you associated with or how they market it? Or?
Well, yeah, it depends. Empress Woo, I think that it's because it's like, that's the picture that sells, right? And so they just keep using it. And a lot of our, there's one thing I didn't really get into is brokering, plant brokers. And so let's say that I'm a plant breeder. There's actually these plant brokers that actually broker these plants to different companies. And so they might be grown by these different companies, but it's brokered by the same person. And that's the picture that they want on all the tags. If it says, Johnson's Garden Center, they want this picture. If it says, More and More Nursery, they want the same picture.
Mm-hmm.
For continuity across the brand.
Right. And then this wasn't in the chat box, but it was just something that I kind of had been mulling over as you were talking. I clearly see the advantages for why they use those no nonsense names for the cultivar names, so that they can continue selling it under whatever that trademark name or what have you
Right.
is for years and years. But isn't there kind of like a big stink in horticulture about like you're not supposed to use no nonsense names technically for cultivar names and such, and some people don't agree with it? Like isn't it kind of like a controversial thing?
Yeah, really. A cultivar name by the Code of Botanical Nomenclature is supposed to be what they call fanciful. It's supposed to be a fanciful name. And so yes, that is being debated, but I just don't see it being changed.
Yeah.
They'll start, calling it, smelly farts or something, and then nobody will buy it, right?
I feel like at this point it would do nothing but like make it even more confusing. Like there's no way you could ever go back. But I just thought that was kind of a neat, differing view anyway of the matter. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for being with us. We have lots of thank yous in the chat box there, and we are so appreciative. We know that you are in Eastern time, so you're a whole hour later than we are, and that can be difficult. So I'm so sorry, but we do appreciate
No,
you
it's
being
great.
with us. And
Perfect timing. It's bedtime for the kids right now. So
I know, that's what I'm talking about. I'm going to go get mine in the bathtub right now, and we're off to bed. So, all right, guys,
Thank you,
we'll be in
everyone.
touch. Thanks. And we are going to have our awards banquet in February. It won't be in person, but we've got some things in store. So be ready with your bells on to be meeting back here with us the first Thursday in February. And we will be doing recognitions, and I'm going to mail everybody pins, badges, certificates. So you should have those on hand with you already by the time we get ready to do our awards banquet presentation. So thanks for being here with us, and we will talk with y'all soon. Okay.